Hello and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, brought to you by the Institute for Liberal Values. This is where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. Given the recent events in Israel, in this week's podcast, Mike Burke discusses with Elizabeth Spivak and James Petts the ongoing situation, antisemitism, and why we won't make a statement as an organisation so as to afford our individual members, such as myself, to make more dramatic political speech. Okay, hello everybody. The usual preamble, please share, like, subscribe, do all of that wonderful stuff that, I don't know, helps with algorithms and things like that. So today we're going to talk about a couple of things. One of them is related to some content that we're going to put out through the podcast, which is the unfolding situation in Israel and Palestine, and how we should talk about that and how we should think about that. But the main focus of this episode is not specifically on that, but rather an issue that came up relating to that conflict. So, as we've all witnessed, some pretty horrific attacks have happened. I mean, very arguably the worst atrocities of the 21st century. It may not be the worst atrocities of the 21st century. I mean, for example, the stuff that's going on in China with the Uyghurs is possibly even worse. But none of that was filmed. None of that is in our faces, there to be seen in the way that Hamas did, where they filmed it and then posted it all online to brag about, because within whatever social circles they exist, presumably bragging about that stuff increases your social status, helps get funding.
It does for everybody, right? I mean, this is what people do now. They film everything. They film themselves robbing people. They film themselves inside of homes, burglarizing people, because that's what they do. A hunter here, just north of where I live, just sealed his own fate by filming himself, with a not dead deer, essentially almost torturing it, filming himself in front of it and everything. So I think this is people's natural instinct now.
But the most disturbing thing, I mean, this isn't the main issue, but let's talk about this, because this is something that I'd love to get some psychological feedback on. The most disturbing thing for me is not that there aren't sadists, right? We've always known that. It's the apparent fact that they gain status. Like, it's not their dirty little secret. Do you know what I mean? It's not something that they're doing in a basement. When you think of like a sadist, like somebody like the famous serial killer Fred West,
that's not what this is.
It was all in his basement. This is advertised.
Yeah, that's not what this is at all. And I mean, I mean, other than a little bit of research on like taking selfies and that kind of thing. I shouldn't overstate my knowledge of this.
Sure.
But generally speaking, I mean, it's kind of a joke, right? If you don't put it online, it didn't happen, right? And it sounds like a joke, but I'm pretty sure that it's not to a lot of people. That this is how people interact with one another. This is how people connect with one another now. It's all about through the internet and I mean, through these selfies and postings and that kind of thing. I think it's natural. I think it's the default now. I just think it's the default. And so, but yeah, I mean, we do digress. I think I wouldn't
go on.
I was going to say your first instinct, Institute for Liberal Values meets, once a week. And, this was in the forefront. Although certainly since we have been meeting, the Russia-Ukraine situation has happened. A lot has happened in the world, and the
Mm.
and Institute for Liberal Values has not put out a statement for any of those things, has not taken a public stand as an organization for any recent event. And I think legitimately, I mean, this is part of the selfie thing. This is part of the filming and posting it thing. It's all part of it.
Right.
Is your first instinct, and several people's first instinct was, we need to get out there, we need to put something out there, we need to make a statement, or we need to sign a statement. I mean, we actually received an email, would you like to sign this statement? Several members have signed various statements, and I do think that's part of it. This is it's become action
Mhm.
to post, to sign an open letter, to do a change.org, whatever. That is now just the same way that people are connecting through social media, texting, that kind of thing. People are taking action, and I'm using air quotes here, by making a post, by making a statement, by signing something. And that's, you and I think that's odd. I don't think that, though, although you and I are, 20 years apart in age, right? And that was your first instinct. So you're certainly more sort of in that culture. You use social media more than I do. You have more, um,
I use
it was
social media.
it was, yeah, exactly. You actually use it. Yes. It was certainly not my first instinct at all to post something or to sign a statement or to put out a statement. And, my feeling was, who gives a crap what the Institute for Liberal Values thinks about this? Nobody cares. It's not going to change anything. It's not going to, the world is not going to go, oh my God, the Institute for Liberal Values is, just posted a statement. So that was, but I do think that there's been a change, a shift, and that's what people do now, and that is considered, important or meaningful or whatever.
I I think there was a
But
material. I think there was a material difference. So I wasn't inclined to put out a statement about Ukraine at all. And the reason for that was that there was nobody who was in favor of Russia, or very few people who were in favor of Russia. Okay, there might have been a couple of nutcases on the far right who think that Putin is the savior of Christendom and all that kind of nonsense, instead of an incompetent and corrupt dictator. But, because Russian propaganda is really good, but, within liberal circles, within the New York Times, Harvard, the sane people on the internet, there was nobody who was really arguing that Russia was right to invade Ukraine. There might have been some people on the center right who were saying Ukraine needs to defend itself, but America is committing too much aid. And we should be focusing on things back home, the kind of isolationist position. There may have been some of that. But again, nobody was really saying that, very few people were cheering Vladimir Putin on. What was different about the Israel thing for me, and what really upset me in a way that I haven't been upset for a very long time, which is 2 years, by the way, because
so not that long.
well, I mean, just time's speeding up
Yeah.
with social media and stuff, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much stuff is going on around the world at the moment
Yes.
because China and Russia are trying to spark World War III, and they're not going to succeed. But that's what they're trying to do in order to kind of change the global order from a unipolar to a multipolar world. It's not going to happen, but that's what they're trying to do, and that's what what is behind a lot of these conflicts. in the sense that the tensions already existed, but they're able to put a lot of pressure to bring them to the forefront. What I saw was a lot of I've lost friends over this, and I'm happy to lose friends over this. So the history of Israel is complex. The land has changed hands like any other contested piece of land, and bad things have been done by both sides, and it is complex, and I'm happy to admit that. But the state of Israel exists now. People live there. The people who live there, by and large, have not been responsible for any of these transgressions. Israel is a liberal democracy. If you are a gay person and you want to go and make out with your boyfriend in a gay nightclub in Tel Aviv, you can absolutely do that. If you want to fly to Israel as a non-Israeli and start saying that Benjamin Netanyahu is a complete idiot, you can do that, and the IDF will still protect you against Hamas. The kind of rights that you were afforded in Israel just isn't on offer really anywhere else in the region. I mean, the only exception used to be Lebanon, but now that's a basket case. And so that there is a certain set of values that we share with Israel, a liberal set of values, which is obvious in the fact that you can do the kind of things that you could do in Tokyo or in the United States or in the UK. And regardless of past historical problems, Israel has repeatedly said it is quite up for a two-state solution. And the Palestinians, or at least who they've elected, which is Hamas, have not been. Hamas have quite openly said, look, we pretended that we were no longer in the business of terrorism and that we were playing, they're openly saying this, by the way, that we were looking after the Palestinian people, when in fact what we were doing is diverting all of the foreign aid, which was sent to look after these people's humanitarian needs, and we were diverting that into terrorism. You got videos of Hamas digging up water pipes that had been donated to them by the EU, boasting about this and turning them into rockets. So all of that aid that we were giving to Palestine to help the people there who were very needy was being diverted into murder. And this is just, none of this is being reported, or very little of it is being reported. And then we have the worst, again, what is happening in China may be worse, but appalling, and certainly the worst crimes that have ever been recorded like that in the history of the 21st century, at least, openly advertised. And people I know are trying to say, oh, this is all Israel's fault, or they deserve it, or trying to make moral equivocation between rape, slaughter, and the situation as it exists right now between Israel and Palestine. And this is the BBC. This is some journalists I know who can't, intelligent, liberal people who won't condemn Hamas. An organization that is oppressing the Palestinians too, by the way, right? And so I felt fucked off.
Yeah, no,
basically.
go ahead. So that's what I wanted to get to. So
sure.
What do you think made you feel so you have, you clearly have, both knowledge and opinion here about this topic, right? So what is it that you think then made you feel like that ILV should make a state? So how did you get from, I have knowledge and opinions that I would like to share, to I would like ILV, to Institute for Liberal Values, to make a statement? I'm just kind of wondering if you can.
Sure.
Can you
yes,
kind of?
Yes. Because there is a role for discourse, right? Online discourse, Twitter, and the rest of it. We know how effective it can be. Unfortunately, you personally know how effective discourse on Twitter can be because of the damage that was done to you. Now, that was all wrong. It was all misinformation. It was all lies. It was very, very malevolent. But from the point of view who is trying to damage an Elizabeth Spivak, that was a successful action, right? So it is powerful. So, I mean, like one of the debates that I was having with quite a famous journalist who used to be a friend of mine, probably isn't anymore. He was saying, because he couldn't unequivocally condemn Hamas. By the way, you can be in favor of Palestine. In fact, if you are in favor of Palestine, you should unequivocally condemn Hamas, because they've been taking all of the aid that was there to fulfill the needs, like in terms of clean water and stuff like that, of the Palestinian people, and turning it into weapons to kill innocent Jewish people, and firing them from apartment blocks or hospitals because they want to attract returning fire. And the reason why they say that is important is because they believe, and this is not my words, this is not the IDF, it's not Israel, this is what Hamas actually say. They actually say that the senior leaders of Hamas will openly say that the best that they can hope for their children, for innocent people, is to die in the cause, because that's great. They'll go straight up to heaven. Isn't that wonderful? That's the value that they put on human life. They say, we know that the Israelis value human life. That's why we fire rockets from civilian buildings, because they value life and we value death. And liberal people, good, innocent liberal people in the West, just can't get their head around that logic. They can't believe that anybody would think that way, but they do. So but more to the point, with regards to your question, like why did I instinctively feel that we should make a statement? It's because people don't understand that.
Okay, so
and we need to educate them on things like that. We need to educate them on what the mindset of people like Hamas is. And there is so much propaganda out there. People say that the Jews are, the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory has always been that the Jews are puppeting certain media organizations, and they have their tendrils everywhere and the rest of it. If that was the case, then the coverage of this would be one-sided in favor of Israel, and it really isn't. So in a sense, I think that online discourse is incredibly effective, as you would know because of your experiences. And I myself want to use that because I know that my enemies are using it.
right.
My enemies are using it against liberalism. An attack on Israel is an attack on liberalism, in my view.
Right. And of course, my my argument or my thoughts, I guess, were that the Institute for Liberal Values is a non-sectarian, non-partisan organization. Says that right in the mission statement.
Right.
And that to invite discourse, that we as an organization should not make a statement, because that could potentially chill or stifle some people's ability or belief in their ability to express an opinion, even if it were just for the purposes of a discussion or something like that. Once your organization has come out, and again, I am kind of speaking from personal experience, right? Because my organization, my university came out and said, this is what we believe, and this is there are people, and they named us who, without discussing it with us at all, they don't believe what you all believe, what we all believe, we and then there's them, right? And so I suggested that we sort of follow what's known as the Kelvin report, which we talked a little bit about with Lee Jussum in a previous podcast, which is focused on universities, but it really does say. So, for example, here's one line. It's very short, by the way. By design and by effect, it is the institution which creates its content with existing social arrangements and proposes new ones. A good university, so in this case, a good organization like Socrates, will be upsetting. The instrument of dissent and criticism is the faculty member and the student. So in this case, us, right, and listeners and other, other people affiliated and unaffiliated with ILV. It's the home and sponsor of critics. It is not itself a critic, a community of scholars. So independent of political fashions, passions, and pressures, embrace, be hospitable to, and encourage the widest diversity of views within its own community. It is a community, but only for the limited but great purposes of teaching and research. It is not a club, trade association, or lobby. It should not take collective action it cannot take collective action without inhibiting the freedom of dissent on which it thrives. If it insists that, or even suggests that all members favor a social party minority views, become censored. Neutrality is not a lack of courage. It is not indifference. It is not insecurity. It arises out of respect for free inquiry and cherished respect for the diversity of inputs. So this is,
So here's the thing. All of that I understand. I've read before. We've talked about before. We've done podcasts on before. All of that before I've read and passionately agree with. But when it's something as close to your heart as this,
then you should make a statement. Everything
I
that
have.
is,
I've made
yes,
lots of statements.
Right. But so, and maybe and again, like different people within ILV have signed statements or made statements, and I fully support that. I don't support the Institute for Liberal Values making a statement, and again, in part because I don't think I really don't see. I see it only as, somebody doesn't, we don't put the preposition the before something or a comma before, somewhere, and it's something to be criticized for, and the meaning, the spirit and the meaning is lost, and it becomes something to attack as opposed to something that that came from maybe the heart.
But see, this is the thing. Like, I am extremely confident that what I am arguing here is correct, in terms of, and that's why I have lambasted people online. And I haven't signed anything, by the way. I've just got into loads of scraps because that's just the way I do things. But, equally, many of the academics who signed various statements regarding the death of George Floyd about systemic racism in America, and America being an inherently racist state and unconscious bias motivating all actions and leading to the disparity between racial groups and so on and so forth. They were just as convinced as I was that they were right. And so the problem becomes, the first question shouldn't be really, is the ideological orthodoxy that you adhere to, is it correct or not? It's the danger inherent to enforcing ideological orthodoxies, full stop, on an institutional level, again, which is distinct from an individual level. So when I agree with your stance, and I'm grateful to you for kind of talking me down, no, I am. But that's really, really important, because the ILV not taking a position on this in no way undermines my ability or makes the position that I take any weaker. Nor does it follow from ILV not taking a position that I don't think, or that I think Hamas are any less reprehensible.
Or that ILV doesn't care. I mean, again,
that's not what an institution is it? So, like, it's are there people in ILV that don't care about the Israel-Palestine thing? I don't think
there
so.
Might be, but there could be, and they're allowed to not care.
They're allowed to not care. Maybe they're just not bothered about it. Maybe it's like, I'm sorry, I'm more interested in El Salvador. I mean, whatever, and that's okay. I mean, it's okay from an institutional level. I mean, I would argue that you should care about things like this. I mean, especially about liberalism, especially about Israel, because it is liberalism that is under attack. But the solution to liberalism being under attack can't be to taking a liberal stance, right? Because if I start saying, well, liberalism is under attack, therefore I am going to fight back against the attacker against liberalism, and I feel that you should too, and I try and persuade you, all of that's completely fine. But at the moment where I start to say, well, therefore points of view contrary to my own are not allowed, or, you know, even a statement wouldn't be doing that, but it's kind of heading in that direction, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And we don't want to impair our integrity as a home of intellectual freedom, right? We don't want to do that. I did want to share too. There have been a couple of Chronicle of Higher Ed articles, and I think a couple of them brought up a couple of really good points, not necessarily related to ILV, but certainly along these same lines. So one of them, so this is by Blake Smith, and it's actually from October of 2022. So, obviously a year prior to the recent events. So faculty and students in higher education frequently find their, emails, inboxes addressed to the university community, expressing solidarity, grief, other forms of concern. And the person asks, what are these messages for? And the answer that they come up with is that, they appear to be the university speaking to itself through no one human vessel, reminding itself what its feelings and opinions are, and framing events to be managed with the resources of its administrative bureaucracy. The university speaking to itself through the position statement could imagine its administrative apparatuses of care and surveillance, but certainly not significantly the scholarly missions of teaching and research as participating in some national struggle. And although they often encourage conversation and dialogue as a means of healing, they actually are shutting them down with some of these statements. And I think, I don't know if at your university there has been a lot of that going on, either of the universities that you've been affiliated with recently.
Yeah, so, one of my universities, and this is like the whole thing. So when George Floyd things happened, it was all emails of solidarity with the Black community, as if the Black community actually existed, with all those different cultural backgrounds, ethnicities, languages, regional differences. The Black community is just so moronic. But anyway, again, the insistence that there is the Black community and they are expressing solidarity with it is itself kind of coercive, isn't it? It's like, you must go along with this, otherwise you disagree with all Black people, which is just bollocks, inaccurate and stupid.
And suggesting that people who are upset or who care about these things visit various university offices or get counseling at the university. And as if the university was actually doing something.
No, and they don't give a fuck.
And they're not.
No, and they don't care. No, it's all vacuous. And here's why you can tell it's vacuous. Because any person who has even a faint acquaintance with criminology, debunked frauds notwithstanding, there was that chap, who was sacked recently, there are frauds within criminology. But if you have a passing familiarity with criminology, you will know that the Ferguson effect is a thing. And it was a thing prior to the death of George Floyd. And you would have known that all of this, even though there was no basis for thinking that Chauvin's crimes were motivated out of racism, let alone even if they were, that it would somehow follow that the whole of Minneapolis police force was racist. Or even if you could establish that the whole of American police force was racist too, a huge chunk of them being ethnic minorities. Being familiar with these things, understanding these basic things that they're not hard.
Which many people at a university specifically should have vast experience
Right,
and knowledge.
that's what
Yes.
criminology. That's what
Yeah.
is a thing at universities
Yeah.
that you
Yeah.
can go and study, right?
Yes.
And if you don't have a course at your university, then there are certainly people you can reach out to without
There will
any
be
trouble.
courses, even if there's not a major. There's
Right,
almost, within
almost certainly.
sociology
Right, right,
or,
right,
yeah,
right, right, right. But even if
yeah,
there isn't, you've got the internet. It's
yeah.
2000. No, fuck it. It's 1995. You know, there's no, you have access to these people. So to be so ignorant, willfully ignorant, and then to say we are in solidarity with the black community, to enforce that on other people, to 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 make them, essentially, to force them to go along with this single line that the whole of the American police force is systemically racist. Whereas if you were a person who was actually concerned, genuinely concerned, with the welfare of black Americans, then you would have known that this will create a Ferguson effect. It will create a chilling effect upon police. Less people will want to be police officers. Those people who are will not want to go into the areas of New York or whatever that are in most need of policing, and therefore crime, especially violent crime, will skyrocket and black people will die.
Yeah.
So if you
Well,
care about black people, then if you're bothered, if that upsets you, then you're human. But you couldn't have been upset about that. You couldn't have gone to a counselor or gone to the university administration and say, look, I'm really concerned that the messaging here is going to get black people killed, even though it did, and even though it was obvious back then. So the ideological coercion didn't help black people, and it was obvious that it wouldn't have helped black people back then, or at least it should have been. So it wasn't about black people.
What my students were trying to do
I
was
know.
actually do something because they cared. So they didn't put out a statement. What did they know? They knew how to do research. Okay. So it's like, oh, we see a potential, a cultural movement that we should study. And so by studying it, then we can learn more about it, and we can educate other people about it, and we can talk to people at conferences. So they were trying to do something, not just sign a statement, not just put out a statement, but actually do something in order to make a difference. And I think often these statements, I mean, the statements have come out about Roe v. Wade. Again, now about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or war, the Ukraine-Russia thing,
Sure.
various, many things. And I can't, it's how people have asked me, well, why can you do research still? Well, yes, I can, but I would have to tell my students, we need to look at what the university sanctions, and our research must stay within those lines. And what would be the point of that?
I mean, I've been told to keep my research secret.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
Don't tell anybody what you're doing.
Right.
What you're doing is really, really good. It's really, really important.
Right.
But the quality is excellent. But
don't tell anybody.
Don't draw it all. Don't draw attention to yourself. Right. And this is I'm being told this by people who agree with me on everything I'm writing. Don't whatever you do, don't draw attention to yourself, or at least not now. Right. So I mean, yeah, the ideological coercion. Look, first of all, it doesn't necessarily follow from a statement that ideological coercion is implied. But again, it's a dangerous force to mess around with, because I mean, here's another one, right? So one of my universities around the time of the death of George Floyd was, solidarity with the black community and all that kind of nonsense, again, which is just doesn't make any sense because the black community does not exist. But and then a couple of days ago, there's a whole delay. So as soon as the George Floyd thing happened, the statement was there within a few hours, right? Boom, sent out to the university community. The Israel-Palestine thing took at least a week. And guess what they were saying? Can you guess what they said?
I presume there's good people on both sides, something like that. Yeah.
There are terrible atrocities, but there are good people on both sides. We need to play to this. And then, believe this, at the end of it, it is important we uphold the core values of our university, which includes freedom of speech.
Yeah.
Fuck off.
So my university did a similar thing. Now they waited until because I live in the Boston area. Okay, so and my university is a smaller state unit school, but they waited until a couple of the the Harvards and the MITs and those people came out, and then they made their statement. But here's what I thought: they didn't do the whole free speech thing. But what our president did was condemn. In advance, say that no bullying would be tolerated on campus. So and I'm like, wait a minute, you not only tolerated bullying, you actually actively endorsed.
No,
you,
not even perpetrated.
you bullied me, you scapegoated us, and you encouraged other people to continue with that. And now you're saying that. But anyway, I mean, maybe it's because they
but it's important to dwell
something.
on that.
Maybe it's because they learned something.
No, it's not. No, it's come on. Do you believe that?
No, I don't, but I'm just saying it could happen.
I mean, it's possible, but
yes, it is statistically possible.
It's statistically possible.
Yes. So
no.
a couple of other people wrote. So that was one article. Another one was similar. Now is the time. This is by Jeffrey Flyer. Now is the time for administrators to embrace neutrality, and they're kind of saying, maybe they've learned, from previous statements that they should actually revisit the Calvin Committee report from the University of Chicago in 1967. So that was, basically the gist of that article. And then another one by Adrian Liu, The Apocalyptical University. And so they're saying, Adrienne is saying that she gives a little history of the Calvin report here, but she's again suggesting that, deans, and so she's talking not just university presidents anymore. Now it's deans and department chairs who have access to departmental social media accounts and websites, and that they're getting pressure. So it isn't just the university as a whole now. Now it's like more, they're requiring commitments, requiring advocacy, requiring action, requiring that people, sort of like lean in, I guess, as a sort of as evidence of their commitment to academic discourse. But again, once you put something out there, and this also happened at my university, where a department came out, sent it all to the entire campus. A department came out and denounced us. And when I confronted someone who had been friendly to me in the past, and I said, I said, I can't. I'm not going to let you get away with, I'm not just going to sit here and let you get away with that. Your department just issued a statement that, that condemned us for doing good research. And she said, well, what could I do? It was my department. Now, I have no idea if she endorsed don't know, because so either she was saying, well, what could I do? I didn't agree, but I couldn't say that I didn't agree. Or she's saying, well, what can I do? My department believes this. And so now, therefore, and I believed it also, so it isn't just universities. It isn't just this sort of, the larger corporation, but now it's like, oh, well, now my department chair or my dean, or if you're in a corporation, my manager, my store, like maybe Starbucks, this is going on at Starbucks, a singular store, wants to put up a rainbow flag or something. And, it's like, then corporate gets involved, don't do that, or do that, or whatever. And so it gets more and more complicated, because everyone needs to do Everyone needs to do a statement for their group, whoever the group is,
Right.
whoever we
Right.
are. And so I'm glad that at least for now, ILV has decided to let each of us do our own thing and to support whatever that is in principle. If even if they don't support what we put out, they support our or don't put out, they support
But
our decision.
I mean, that has to be kind of quite central.
Hmm.
And I get it. And the thing is, Elizabeth, I got it before you even mentioned it to me. And this is also part of the point, right? When passions get inflamed, that's when things like there is an inclination, and sometimes for all of the best reasons, perhaps, to kind of throw free speech out of the window,
Hmm.
to throw freedom of conscience out of the window, and start to insist upon some line of ideological conformity. I mean, not least because your opponents are doing that, right? So, but you have to hold true to your principles, and none of the neutrality of the organization that you are a member of does not impinge upon your right to be non-neutral as an individual, and that's the kind of point. Because you can't be non-neutral easily if the institution you belong to is not neutral, right? Because there's
Right.
always going to be some tension there between the two. Either your organization is neutral and agrees with everything you say, in which case you become a tyrannical leader of an organization, or the organization remains neutral and therefore people are able to express themselves. And so that's absolutely vital. But there is that temptation, isn't there? It's always...
Yeah, I mean, you have to acknowledge that you're in your you were not neutral individually, but that the organization needs to tolerate that non-neutrality in the organization and support people's ability to discuss things and everything. So we had quite a heated discussion in our meeting, and it was good.
It was fun.
It was
It was
it was
it was
good.
very
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah.
Um,
And I know you're going to have a discussion a little bit later with somebody else in our
yeah, follow up
organization
with
and
James.
talk about the same thing. Will be
Right.
an entirely different perspective.
Yes. Yeah, James always
Yes.
has entirely different perspectives.
Yes.
Um, um, rely upon him for that.
Yep.
Yeah. So we will follow this up. James, who is a barrister, which is, for all the Americans listening, a very posh, high-end lawyer, in London. So kind of the peak of the English legal establishment, if you like. So he knows his stuff on this. So we will discuss the whole making statements thing with... Well, I will, because you're not going to be here, are you?
No, I will not. Yeah.
No,
It's the
it'll
middle of
be...
the night for me, so I'm going to let you handle that.
It's one of the fun things about juggling different time zones, that you can't
Yes.
always have people on at the same time. So I'll handle that, but I think we'll probably merge these into one podcast,
Yeah.
I guess. Excellent. And one more point I think that's important. And I think you raised this in the meeting that we had. One thing that you see about these statements is that they tend to be vacuous. You know, like
Yes.
you mentioned that it's the university talking to itself. You know, is there any real quality of reflection in there? No, otherwise you would have realized, otherwise whoever put out these vacuous statements would have realized that they're actually doing people harm. You know,
And
hence the
yeah.
Ferguson effect. It's not
Yeah.
helpful. It's, you know, but also there are better ways of doing things. You know, if you, as a liberal organization, if you want to advocate for Israel, as I do, then you can do so in content, you know, in content that is a liberal discussion between members of your institution. You're not speaking for the institution, you're just speaking for the members of the institution. But the institution can put that out, and that's something that we are doing. So there will be another podcast. I'm not sure if it's been uploaded yet, between David and Brandy and I, who are... David and Brandy are two Jewish, quite well-known Jewish scholars. in which we look in depth at the issues of anti-Semitism and the state of Israel and the problems that it faces. So we are putting that content out. It's not that we're falling silent. The individual members, some of us are very cross indeed at the moment. Me being one of them.
Yes.
Good. All right. Thank you very much. Okay, so hello and welcome back to part 2. I'm here with James Petts, who is a barrister in the UK, very posh lawyer. Isn't that right, James?
Well, that isn't a word that I would normally choose to describe myself.
Sorry, I couldn't resist myself. James and I have this kind of playful back and forth that we both enjoy, or at least I enjoy it. So in the first part, and I think these will be blended together into one podcast, merged if you like. I was discussing with Elizabeth initially the problem with the Palestine-Israel situation that's going on right now and the frustrations that I felt regarding some of the reactions to that. But also on the kind of knee-jerk reaction I had. So my first reaction was, look, this is, in my view, an attack on liberal democracy by people who don't share the values of liberal democracy, who have a completely, the people orchestrating the Hamas attacks, I would say, and the people carrying them out, who have a way of thinking that is quite alien for us and quite difficult for us to understand. We tend to naturalize and assume they think like us, and they actually don't fundamentally. And because it was an attack on liberalism and liberal democracy, my knee-jerk, war-ready, reaction was, let's do what I would never do under any other circumstances, right? Let's put out an institutional statement. Now, the problem with putting out institutional statements is that you're kind of coercing your members. So it's fine as a member of an organization. In fact, it's great. I mean, that's the whole purpose of not having statements and narrow ideological principles, because that enables people to have their own points of view. It protects people's speech. But my knee-jerk reaction was to throw that to the wind and just say, let's put down put our foot down and make a statement, because this is an attack on liberalism in my view then, and I think you and Elizabeth kind of talked me out of it. So thank you for that. Shall we start there? Should we start more broadly about the problem and some of the coercion that's gone along with this? I mean, where would you like to start?
Well, we can start wherever you like.
Okay. So just before we started recording, before the button was pressed, James and I were discussing some of the reactions that I had to people who were trying to set up a kind of a moral equivalency between what had happened to Israel and Israeli civilians and the actions of Hamas. And these people would make the point that, look, yeah, of course, the actions of Hamas are absolutely atrocious. There's no getting way around that. But I'm not going to condemn Hamas, because the actions of Hamas have been solely caused by the Israeli government. That if you like, that Hamas has no agency, no moral agency at all. To which my response was, okay, I mean, and I don't necessarily think this is a perfect metaphor. In fact, I don't think it's anything close to a perfect metaphor. But by giving the devil more than his due, it kind of helps illustrate the point. So I said to James, this is an example, and the example I used to them, if I locked you up in my basement and you, for a couple of years, and you managed to break free, and then you murdered me and my whole family, I mean, let alone tortured them and sold them into slavery or whatever, would you be justified in doing that? Because the moral equivalence argument seems to say that they are. To which the response of these people was, okay, yeah, all right, Mike, we've got a few years on you. When you grow up a bit, you'll understand it a lot better. Which is patronizing in extreme and nonsense.
Well, it's scrutiny suppressing, right? So these people are deliberately saying that instead of engaging in the substance And a reasonable inference to draw from that is they know they can't engage in the substance. They know they have no actual reasons to substantiate the claim they're making. And so they're deliberately trying to distract from that fact. And it's really important that that never be tolerated. When people do that, it is abusive behavior, no matter what. This is to an extent a tangent from the specific Israel-Palestine thing, but actually the fact that people's ideas aren't being scrutinized enough is part of what allows the bad ideas that fundamentally and ultimately give rise to this and other conflicts to emerge.
Yeah, and so in a philosophy class, we'd call it an ad hominem fallacy, right?
Yes, certainly. So the ad hominem fallacy is, it isn't just what some people think it is, which is responding to an argument by saying something nasty about the person. It's more fundamental than that. It's a claim that whether to accept or reject an argument can be determined by knowing something about the person making the argument. And that's fundamentally incoherent.
Yeah, quite. I mean, I think a lot of people get the ad hominem fallacy wrong, and it's kind of like one of those sucker punches that I use in arguments when I kind of set people up for it. Whereas if I was to say, for example, say somebody has made a series of bad arguments, you've made bad argument 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and on that basis, I conclude that you're not very good at arguments. I am making a criticism of you as a person, but that wouldn't be an actual ad hominem fallacy, right? Because it would be substantiated evidence. Precisely, it would be reasonable. So some people say when you say something nasty about somebody that's necessarily an ad hominem fallacy. It might not be. It might be perfectly reasonable. It's when you attack somebody instead of engaging with what they are saying. So in the case that I went through it, when they're saying, "Oh, you're just young. You know, when you grow up, you'll get it." They're avoiding engaging with me by going on to some irrelevant aspect of my character.
Yes, I mean, for any rational observer, right, that should be interpreted as a tacit admission that they have no argument, that they know they have no argument, and they're trying deliberately to distract from that, and they're trying to cause people to believe something that they know they have no reason to believe is true.
The only thing I'd say to that is, unfortunately, the best arguments don't always win out. I've been in situations
because people behave like that, and the best arguments don't win out. Right? It's precisely that kind of mindset that stops it, and it's acceptance of that mindset that stops best arguments winning out, which is precisely the point.
Very good. So moving on specifically to the issue at hand, as an individual, what have your reactions been to the events as they've unfolded? How have you engaged with it or not engaged with it?
Well, I don't go around making statements because I agree with Elizabeth. That whole idea is daft. But in terms of the substance, I mean, you know much more about the military details and the logistical details of the conflict. My interest is far more in the principles. And so, sorry about the squeaking chair. So I like to stand back and ask what exactly underlies this, and what exactly is the right principled approach to this kind of intractable sectarian conflict, or ostensibly intractable sectarian conflict. And that links into the kind of discussion we were having just now, and the kind of things that people are thinking about putting in statements or not, as the case may be. And the fundamental starting point is that this whole conflict, and many others like it, is a product of sectarianism. And sectarianism is the idea or the behavior of treating a particular group of people, the interest of a particular group of people, as more important than the interest of humanity generally. So the idea that either the Israelis or the Palestinians or people in a particular group or territory should have their interests prioritized over other people's interests, that is sectarianism. And linked to that is the idea of collectivism, which is that the practice of treating a group of people as if they were a person, and subordinating the individual characteristics of those people, the individual choices of those people, to some supposed group interests. Whereas, in fact, a group as such does not have any goals or interests. Only the individuals who make it up have goals and interests. And that doesn't mean that people can't or shouldn't cooperate. Quite the contrary, because actually it's very often an act of non-cooperation to treat people as merely a representative of a group rather than as individuals. But the way in which this kind of conflict plays out is precisely a manifestation of those fundamentally flawed ideas. And the idea that people should be treated harshly, right? Either murdered or have their water supply cut off, depending on which side you're on, as in the Israeli or Palestinian side, because you happen to live in the same country as people who've done something wrong, i.e. the opposite thing, because it's one of those self-escalating conflicts, is precisely the problem. And each and every individual who believes that it is ever appropriate, literally ever appropriate, deliberately to harm one person because some other person in the same group has done something wrong, is evil and is personally responsible for the consequences of that evil.
I would quibble with deliberate. So, on the one hand, deliberate can be quite obvious. If you turn up at a music festival, which was a festival for peace, and you go there and you deliberately murder civilians, and that's quite clear. But how would do you know much about the doctrine of double effect? You probably know it framed as something else in legal theory, right? So the idea would be, if I engage in a war and I know that as a consequence of me trying to kill people who are trying to kill me, that I will inadvertently kill civilians, would you consider that deliberate or not?
Not necessarily, no. It's the things that are deliberate are the things that are aimed specifically at harming civilians. So things like deliberately cutting off everybody's water supply, rather than doing things that are aimed specifically at military targets but have some risk of collateral damage. The latter is a more complex case, which there isn't a categorical answer to it. It may or may not justify depending on circumstances.
Is it not possible that cutting off the water supply might actually be of the benefit for civilians on the opposing side?
I'm skeptical that that's likely to be the case.
So, classic siege mentality. Classic siege warfare, if you starve a population out, or if you cut their water supply, they're more likely to flee from that area to try and find those resources that they can find somewhere else. Therefore, you're taking them away from an area, for example, in which rockets are being fired from, because Hamas tries to fire rockets deliberately from densely populated areas, because they know that that's a deterrent for the Israelis, because the Israelis actually don't want to kill innocent civilians. So by cutting the water supply, it wasn't it was only 11% of the water of Palestine. It wasn't, the whole water supply. But by, kind of starving them out that way, they're not going to stay there and survive and starve. They're more likely to move out. And what would you say to that?
I mean,
is that reasonable?
A way of looking at it, right, is would the Israeli government do that to people who could vote it out, or would only do people who aren't accountable to it? I very much doubt that the Israeli government would do that to people who could vote it out of office, even with the motivation that you suggest.
They forcibly removed Israeli Jews from Gaza when they back in 2005, I think, when they completely gave up control of Gaza. They forcibly removed those people, Jewish people.
That's not quite the same as cutting off people's water supply.
It's cutting them off from their you're uprooting them from their homes, everything that they know. I would say it's broadly comparable, at least. And those people were capable of voting them out.
If you make it so broad, you take out the important details, right? The important detail is that it's malicious. In other words, one is trying to control people by harming them. That's the thing that's really questionable and really a serious problem.
One could make the case in warfare that this might be the most humanitarian way of getting them out. Presuming that you have to eliminate an organization, presuming that we would agree that the only, and I'm not saying that you do, but presuming that we agree that the only way to bring some closure to this conflict would be the complete eradication of Hamas, which is the position of Israel, which I think the United States is on board with too.
I think it would be the complete eradication of any and all sectarian extremists, not just those confined to one particular organization. Confining it to an organization just means you end up having other organizations that are similar fundamentally but differ in some superficial respects starting up.
Possibly, but that's not the line of the Israeli government. The Israeli government is not calling for the eradication of the Palestinian Authority or of Palestine. Palestine and the Palestinian Authority.
Eradicate Palestine, right? You'd need to eradicate each and every individual who's sectarian and who behaves in a sectarian extremist way. You can't try to destroy a particular organization that has characteristics. Doesn't really help when anyone can just set up another organization. That's not the right way of thinking about it. And that's the fundamental problem. If you're thinking about organizations themselves rather than the people who happen to form themselves into organizations as the thing you're dealing with, the collectivist mindset. That's a fundamental problem.
Well, what do you think that both the Gulf Wars achieved with regards to the Arab world? Because the general consensus, as far as I know it, would be that they, after Saddam Hussein tried to tangle with the US military, that it sent a message right across the Arab world that you don't mess around with the Americans, and therefore a firm deterrent was set, and that deterrent works to this day, which is why there are currently two carrier strike forces in the carrier strike groups, in the Eastern Mediterranean. And that's the thing that stopped, for example, things from escalating. So the argument would be, I guess, from an Israeli point of view, that we, by cutting the water supply, we force the civilian population out, albeit in, they by the way, they tried before saying, please leave. This isn't ideal, but this will hopefully get the civilian population to leave because they will need to seek water from somewhere else, thereby leaving behind the more hardcore militant factions, terrorist factions in Hamas, and therefore they can attack without causing so many civilian casualties. So, I mean, there is a rationale to be made there, I would argue.
Yes, I mean, it's difficult to unpick that in practical terms, not least because there's a real risk, isn't there, that the extremists who are running the Gaza Peninsula will themselves force the civilians to stay where they are.
Well, they're trying, yeah.
Yes,
so, for example, yeah, go ahead.
Authoritarian regimes normally try to keep their population in place and not let them leave. That's the whole Iron Curtain mentality. They want them to be there to carry on doing the work and producing economic productivity, which ultimately goes to the leaders.
Yeah, but I mean, we're not talking about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had a massive military that really was able to keep people in place. Hamas militias may be able to do some of that, but not an awful lot, as we've seen by the droves and droves of people leaving.
Is Israel granting asylum to Palestinian citizens?
No. Should they?
Well, yes. Why should where one was born affect where one be entitled to live? It's a very bizarre idea when you think about it.
Is it?
Yes, of course. It's completely arbitrary.
If you tie it to geography, then of course it would be completely arbitrary. But if you tie it to culture, it might not be.
Well, that's even more arbitrary, isn't it?
If somebody,
the culture in which one was born is not. It's one's individual choices in life that are important. Culture is.
I completely agree. I completely agree.
So,
and so, if somebody was to absolutely disavow Hamas and the Islamist ideology and do so in a convincing way, then I would argue that Israel should accept those people, and it has accepted quite a lot. I mean, the population of Israel is 20% Arab. Not just Palestinians, a lot of Palestinians, but people from all over the Arab world. They have two political parties in Israel. A lot of them are quite high up within the IDF, including some heroes. Some of them were even involved in the immediate reactions to the conflict that just opened. So, there is this kind of notion that Israel is not open to accepting anybody at all. That's not entirely true. But you can understand the Israeli government being suspicious, given the sad fact that terrorists will embed themselves within the civilian population, as Hamas and Gaza have been very good at doing.
Yes, and
so how do we differentiate?
One suspects that part of the reason for doing that is precisely to make it harder for people to leave for the same Iron Curtain mentality, right? So that's the method that smaller organizations use that don't have the sort of might of the military of the Soviets that you described, but it's the same goal.
Right. Of course, yeah. So what would be, if you were King David of Israel, how would you deal with the refugee crisis problem?
I mean, I think to suggest detailed practical solutions probably requires a little more detailed information than I have available. So I can, again, talk about principles. And the starting point is it's quite wrong, fundamentally, to treat one person with more suspicion than another to the extent of actually coercing that person merely because of a risk that applies equally to all people. So it's wrong to say to any given person, you are from a particular country. I don't know anything about you personally, but there's a risk that people from your country might be terrorists, and therefore I'm going to coerce you. That's the thing that's fundamentally wrong.
But isn't that the reality of the way in which we have to live in this world? We have to make unfortunate snap decisions about people that may not be grounded in reality, because the risk of not doing so is so dangerous. To give you an evolutionary perspective, if you are a person, a human being in, I don't know, prehistoric India, and you hear a rustling in the leaves, the chances of the rustling in the leaves at nighttime being a predatory tiger that's going to eat you are relatively small. And yet the people who acted upon those fears were nevertheless more likely to pass down their DNA to the next generation. And so therefore you're kind of asking us to override something that not only is very fundamental to our psyche, although I do get you don't get an ought from an is, right? Just because it's fundamental to our psyche doesn't mean that that's a moral claim. But nevertheless, from a consequentialist point of view, does help us survive, or has helped us survive.
But I'm not
and
sure
so
that
you can make a moral claim. You could make a consequentialist moral claim on that point of view. From that point of view, that you should uphold that principle.
Valid. There are two different strands to this.
Sure.
First of all, there's the point that, as you made, the fact that people think that way doesn't make it right. And there are lots of instances in which people in any given human society must suppress their base desires in order to live in a society. And this is just one of the many examples of that. Right? So that's the fact that it's some kind of base desire is a reason that it's important to be extra stringent about making sure you don't allow that to proliferate rather than anything else.
Yeah, but
in terms of the second strand, the point is that it is precisely that attitude that gives rise to the intractable nature of the conflict in the first place. That both sides taking that attitude consistently is precisely the thing that makes the conflict intractable. And it will be intractable so long as that is an attitude that people have.
But both sides aren't taking that view. The government of Israel hasn't taken that view. The government of Israel, again, like Israel is 20% Arab. I mean, that's a significant portion of the population.
One treats people differently depending on what country they're from, rather than assessing individual characteristics.
Okay, so your argument would be that they aren't treating Arabs that way, but they are treating Palestinians that way.
Yes.
See, I mean, I would have argued that there was so much progress that happened prior to this event. More and more working visas, were being given to Palestinians who were crossing over to do work in Israel. The Israeli government now feels that has to come to an end.
Well,
you can kind of understand them.
That Hamas didn't really want that kind of progress, right? Because
no, quite the contrary. Hamas have openly said in some of their interviews they didn't. Was Ali Bakir or one of their senior leaders did an interview for the Arabic version of Russia Today, and he literally said we had performed in the last 2 years in a way that we had tried to convince Israel that we were building up towards statehood, that we had given up our resistance ideology. Resistance is what they call it, and the whole function of that was just to lull them into a false sense of security so that we could hit them with this attack. So you're right.
Well, that's the point, right? I don't imagine, apart from in that short-term sense of lulling people to a false sense of security, I don't imagine that in the long term, Hamas actually wants there to be that level of cooperation, because it's an authoritarian regime that suppresses the people who live in Gaza.
Yeah.
So the people who live in Gaza are victims of the Hamas regime just as much as the people who live in Israel are, in fact, to a larger extent, because people who live in Gaza are more easily directly controlled by the Hamas regime.
Absolutely.
And the Hamas regime deliberately wants there to be tension and conflict between the two sides, and deliberately wants there to be sectarianism, because that will advance the interest of the leaders of that organization and enhance its power over its own population. So the act of treating all the people who live in Gaza as one with the government drastically increases the power of the government, the evil government, over the people who live there.
But we are talking about a democratically elected government here.
Oh yes, and lots of democratically elected governments are evil. I mean, the President Putin was democratically elected, right? Many years ago.
A long time ago, yeah.
Adolf Hitler was democratically elected.
Yep.
So that doesn't really take us very far.
I think it justifies having some suspicion of the people from that area. You know,
But
I
not
mean, the
all the
consequences of getting it. No, I mean, if you lived in some kind of ideal world in which you could brain scan the people coming in to find out whether or not they were on the side of Hamas, you know, then this wouldn't be a problem. But the reason why this evolutionary quirk, which is in which we extrapolate, unfortunately, and we get it wrong a lot of the time, the reason it exists is because it's adaptive by and large, no? And that the consequences it
It's
creates.
adaptive in the circumstances which it evolved.
Well,
which was not
is
a
it not
modern
adaptive
society.
anymore?
I'm not convinced. Well, I mean, the thing that you describe is just having fear of things that might have a small chance of having a high degree of risk. That's a completely different thing to the kind of sectarian collectivist ideation that is the real problem. So the people who run these authoritarian regimes, Hamas and the Russian government and everything else, rely on the people that they control being treated as part of them by outsiders in order to get their power.
Sure.
And the things they do in conflict, including the acts of terrorism, are specifically, one can realistically infer, intended to have that effect.
Of course.
And they do have that effect. Right?
Of
and
course.
So the conflict will never be tractable as long as other people play along with it.
But when polling suggests that, and let's say this is correct, when polling suggests that 75% of the population of Gaza are in favor of the war that Hamas started against Israel, and of course, you know, that leaves a hell of a lot of Palestinians who are not in favor of it, but nevertheless a significant majority. Is not some suspicion warranted about letting people like that in? Bearing in mind, of course, that Egypt and Jordan have refused to take anybody at all.
I mean, the evil is in treating everyone as if they are all have a characteristic, when you know that only a proportion have that characteristic. Right? Imagine another example. Imagine a town in which 75% of the crime is committed by people with dark skin. Mm-hmm. Would it ever be right to say, you're a dark-skinned person, therefore I should treat you as a criminal in that?
No, but that's quite different. No, but that's quite different.
Well, I'm not sure it is it?
No, it is, because you're talking about the influence of an ideology, an Islamist ideology, a religious ideology, as opposed to a completely arbitrary ethnic status that has no bearing upon the way in which somebody might think, that whether they're a conservative or a liberal.
Any given person in that territory is influenced by that ideology. That's sort of the point, isn't it?
Well, it's quite difficult to know to what extent, but one would assume it's significant, given that, you know, a recent poll, and okay, let's downgrade it. Let's say it's 50%. It's a hell of a lot of people who are going along with the specific aims of an Islamic jihad against Israel. They think it's a good idea. They say it's a good idea.
But that doesn't engage with the reason that it's wrong. So if we go back to the example, you could say exactly the same things about there are an awful lot of people who with dark skin who are committing crime. But that doesn't mean that it's right to treat any given individual with dark skin about whom we know nothing other than
Of course it doesn't. Of course it doesn't. But their skin color is not a cause of crime. Whereas believing in a certain ideology, and when people go ahead and then commit those crimes and they say that they're doing it because of that ideology, you know, it's I think reasonable to be suspicious of people who adhere to that ideology, or who you have reason to suspect might do.
There's a non sequitur there, which is that the treatment is not of people who in fact have that particular ideology, but people who live in a particular place. So that's not the same thing at all.
People who you have reasonable grounds to suspect might very well have that ideology. And by the way, I'm not. But if I may, I'm not arguing that Israel shouldn't take in any refugees or shouldn't be allowing. That's not the point that I'm making. The point that I'm making is that I think that Israel is perfectly justified, given the threat to their citizens, which is severe, and the levels of support that Hamas, unfortunately, enjoys in Gaza. I think that Israel is probably quite right to be suspicious of these people. What if...
Yes. The fundamental point is, in the example that I give, there would equally be reason to suspect, to that extent, that any dark-skinned person is likely to be a criminal. Right? No, but that wouldn't be a proper reason for treating any given dark-skinned person as a criminal.
No, it wouldn't be the same. because a dark-skinned person being a criminal isn't inclined to be a criminal by virtue of their dark skin.
But as I said, you don't know whether any given person in that particular area
you certainly
has that
don't.
particular ideology.
No, but you do know that Islamist ideology in the form that Hamas are popular for is an indicator, is a deliberate indicator of their likelihood to commit a terrorist atrocity. And therefore, what do you do?
Do you hold to your treatment to which I'm referring is not based on assessment of people's ideology. It's based on where people live. That's the problem, right?
Okay, so in that case, your argument would be we should try and devise some means of interrogation, for lack of a better verb, in which we ascertain to what extent somebody is a perfectly innocent Muslim.
Well, no, the starting point is you don't treat people differently based on where they live. Any given individual person who does something wrong, right, must be treated very harshly depending on how badly the wrong is. But
of course,
if doing something seriously wrong, that individual must be subject to very harsh treatment indeed, in order for everyone else to be safe. But it's always very dangerous indeed, and will inevitably perpetuate precisely the kind of sectarian conflict that we have here. But if you treat everybody who lives in a particular area or has some particular cultural background or other arbitrary characteristic as being someone to be suspicious of merely because of that thing, and treat that person worse for that reason, that is the thing that is evil.
That seems wonderful. But that seems wonderful, but it does seem kind of logistically impossible. You know, what kind of infrastructure would you need to make in order to achieve that?
But it's that kind of thinking precisely that has made this conflict intractable. So if what you're trying to do is have less conflict, that is not the answer. That will just make it worse.
I'm not sure. I mean, if you want to have less conflict, then letting in a significant number of people who are, you know, you can empirically show a high number of whom are inclined to commit terrorist acts, that's going to result in more death, no?
Again, there's a difference between short and long term. I'm talking about conflict.
Okay.
Right? So that fundamental idea that it's acceptable ever, literally ever, to treat people different, to treat someone worse than someone else merely because of where that person lives, and merely because of some kind of stereotype that one has about the person, even if there's some statistical correlation, just as in the example of the place where a high proportion of dark-skinned people commit crimes, has exactly the kind of consequence you'd expect if you do treat everyone who has dark skin as someone who's a criminal. But again, what motivation does someone who is in that group have?
But ethnicity and ideology are quite different. You know, a person can choose whether or not they go along with an ideology. A person and an ideology does set a set of rules for their behavior.
There's a problem with that response in that it's what you're suggesting is justified is not treating people differently based on those people's ideology, but treating people differently based on where they live, because where they live is correlated with that ideology.
Yeah.
That's the problem, right? So responding to the point about treating people with particular color skin as if they're criminals.
But I'm not saying that it's okay.
Sorry?
I'm not saying it's okay. I'm not, you know, like I completely concede that it is in a way a kind of evil, right? To treat somebody, I wouldn't say poorly, but to be overly suspicious of a given individual because they are likely to believe in a given ideology without really having sufficient evidence to back that accusation up. That is a kind of evil. But the question would be whether that is a necessary evil, given that the consequences of not performing that action would be much worse from a consequentialist point of view. I mean, it sounds like you're very Immanuel Kant kind of you sound very deontological, and you might push back on that.
All, actually, quite precisely the opposite.
Okay.
I fundamentally disagree with deontological ideas. The real question is what is the long-term consequence when applied universally? So you're looking really at very short-term consequences. I'm looking at much longer-term consequences. I rather suspect that the appeal of deontology is people have some kind of implicit idea about long-term consequences but can't articulate it.
Uh-huh.
But I don't think it's realistically likely to be the case that applying the ideology to which you refer, in other words, the equivalent ideology of assuming that all people who have dark skin are criminals, is likely in the long term to result in better outcomes for people overall. It may have some adverse short-term consequences, but it's extremely unlikely that the long-term consequence of behaving that way is anything other than intractable conflict forever.
Well, I think that's quite different. I mean, I would argue again, Israel has a significant number of Muslim Arabs who do not hold to the kind of Islamism that Hamas has, who exist within Israel. But I don't see how you can. I don't even see how it's Israel's responsibility to try and do something to change the minds of these Arabs who, these Palestinian Arabs who hold to this ideology, or what they can do other than, unfortunately, knowing that this is something that you wouldn't like to do, discriminate, knowing that the act of discrimination is itself an evil, but it is best based on ideology, not on ethnicity.
But it isn't based on ideology, right? It's based on assumptions about ideology which can flow from where people live.
It's yeah. But what other judgments are you going to make?
But that falsifies the proposition that it's based on ideology rather than that it's based on territory.
No,
so
it's based on
equivalent.
The likelihood that a given set of individuals will hold to a certain ideology, which is a calculation that you just have to make. How can you not?
Just have to make is the very thing that's
you just have to make, because the consequence will be lots and lots of death.
But short or long term?
Both, actually.
How do you get to long term? I mean, as in over 100 years or so?
I can get there quite easily. Where do you think is where? So the terrorist attacks that have just happened in Israel, because we don't know, neither of us can actually fully. Where are we going to go long term? Neither of us know, right? We can't. We're kind of offering educated guesses, right? No, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Who knows? Where I would guess the way things will happen is I think that this attack on Israel by Hamas has set the peace process back 75 years. I think it will usher in increasingly repressive regimes that are more likely to do worse things to Palestinians than even the present right-wing government has been, of which I'm not a fan.
With the intention, because that will increase the power that Hamas has over its own people, precisely because those right-wing governments do treat everyone who lives in Palestine as if they were part of the Palestinian, or the part of the same ideology, even if they're not, and therefore gives people no incentive to rise up against the government.
So the incentive of an Israeli prime minister is to get re-elected. Do you imagine that allowing lots of Palestinian refugees in, knowing that at least a very big proportion of them may go on to commit terrorist offences, and let's say some of them actually do go on to commit those terrorist offences, then what would the incentive of an Israeli prime minister be within the election cycle that they exist in?
Well, the incentive would probably be to do something that is seriously evil, which is precisely what the evil people who are Hamas are relying on. The problem is the power that a government has to do that kind of thing is a problem. There's a real issue with how people conceive of what it is legitimate for a government to be allowed to do.
So if you were an Israeli prime minister, what would your response be? Would you discriminate or would you not discriminate?
Well, I wouldn't discriminate. I mean, I probably wouldn't stay as prime minister for a very long time, because without actually changing people's views, right, which is the whole point of what we're trying to do here, as to what is legitimate for a government to be allowed to do, right? People are not going to recognize the fundamental evil in collectivist treatment of people. But the point is that without changing those views, this conflict will never resolve itself.
Oh, I don't think it will ever resolve itself anyway.
Sorry?
I don't think it will resolve itself. I don't think it ever resolves itself, this conflict. Not within our lifetimes,
but that means that you don't think that people will ever cease to be collectivist, extremist evil. That's what's necessary to resolve this kind of thing.
I don't think it's fair to call either side, either the Palestinians or the Israelis, collectivist and evil. I think it's right to call Hamas collectivist and evil.
I wouldn't ever call an entire group of people anything, because that's the whole point.
That is itself collectivist,
non-collectivist, right? But the individuals who believe that are evil, and the individuals who perpetrate that are evil. And that is why evil is being done, because there are evil people who are promoting evil ideas and acting on the basis of them.
So would you say that my suggestion that, I'm sorry, we have to be a little bit measured in who we're letting in because of the risk of terrorism, would you say that was evil or just misguided?
I think it's fundamentally wrong and extremely dangerous to treat everyone in a particular group as if they had a characteristic when you know that not everyone in the group actually has that characteristic. And that I'm afraid, is evil.
So what's the alternative?
Not treating everyone in the group as if they had that characteristic.
And then the consequences would be?
The consequences would be, if everyone consistently refused to treat people in a particular group as having a characteristic, it would be much harder for that kind of sectarian conflict to live. I mean, just imagine if you're in Palestine, right, and you have the option of defecting.
Sure.
You have an incentive to do so. If you don't have the option of defecting, right, your only hope is for the people who are in government over you to have some military success, because otherwise you're going to be harmed.
My instinct is to think in the way that you think. My instinct is to, and I think that this is the prevailing instinct in the West, and I think it is one of the great features of liberalism, that we kind of balk at this idea of treating people as if they were a collective, for all the reasons that you've so eloquently put out. But what do we do when those sorts of views are inherent to the ideological makeup of the kind of people that we might be accepting in? That kind of collectivism, that kind of identitarianism, as made manifest, for example, in people coming to the UK and living in communities apart from the rest of us.
Well, again, I mean, people can live in whatever communities they like, right? That's not a meaningful criticism. You're never going to achieve anything worthwhile by being collectivist. You'll only harm people, ultimately. And looking at this very short-term idea of what the consequence might be means ignoring the long term. This is the local maximum trap, right? Which is the fundamental cause of a great deal of unethical behavior. In other words, the idea that people are unable to look at the longer term time horizon as to the ultimate consequences and end up being trapped because of the short term adverse consequences in something that's actually much worse than they would be, just like an addiction, where you have to go through extreme withdrawal symptoms for potentially quite an extended period to have the other side and be in a better position than someone who's an addict. So it's the same kind of issue. There is no end game other than continual conflict and destruction if you allow people to act in a collectivist sectarian way, ever.
So it seems to be your point of view that you would assume that if you were to act liberally towards a bunch of people who had a collectivist ideology that was antithetical to the liberal system within which they were being integrated into, that liberalism would somehow prevail as a matter of course.
No, it's not. That's not precisely the position. The position is that you don't make assumptions about people. Once you know, I have reason to believe that person is in fact doing something wrong, then it's fully justified to impose truly extreme consequences on that individual. I mean, truly extreme consequences. But it's never safe to do that unless you can pick out the individuals who are doing wrong. So the really important thing is to identify the specific individuals who are doing wrong and then impose really extreme consequences on those individuals. I mean, really, really extreme consequences on the individuals who do something seriously wrong. And it's not to allow people to get away with doing wrong.
So I think I'm beginning to unpack where you stand on this. My position would be, it's almost kind of a Thomas Hobbes kind of position, where the Leviathan is kind of like a necessary evil, right? Would be when it comes, not things like ethnicity, but when it comes to things like ideology, when you have reasonable grounds to suspect somebody might be a adherent to a certain ideology, a dangerous ideology, that you are justified in suspicion towards that person, and that this arrives from an adaptive trait, and that adaptive trait does generate negative consequences, certainly, which are obvious, which you've outlined. but very arguably more positive consequences than negative ones. Your position seems to be something like it's never okay to do that. I'm being a bit lazy, maybe, and that laziness is kind of evil. And that instead, what you should be is absolutely draconian with those who you can identify definitely. Would that be correct?
Identify as having done wrong, definitely, yes. And
Okay.
that's the quid pro quo of requiring identification. So the only thing it's just like any kind of justice system, right? You take murderers as an example. You
Sure.
don't treat everyone who is in the kind of same category as people who are more likely to be murderers as if they were murderers.
Right.
But you identify those individual people who have in fact committed murder by a really rigorous process, and then you send them to prison for an extremely long time.
Okay, so let's give you some specific examples then from the UK. I can't remember precisely when it was, but I'm fairly sure I could dig it up if I went online. There was a recent event in which certain pro-Palestinian, whether they were really pro-Palestinian or not, I mean, they may have just been idiots, but they were parading around. Well, you know what it is. I mean, a lot of people follow ideologies and causes because it's just a fashion. You know, I did that when I was at university. I had the kind of Palestinian headscarf because I knew nothing about it. I was just a teenager. No, never been there. Probably you never have been there, knowing you, but people do these.
A three-piece suit at university. Yes, let me go on.
You wore a three-piece suit. Of course you did. That's beautiful.
Called by the newspaper the biggest rebel on campus for doing that.
Give three-piece a chance, eh? Anyway, parading through the streets of London with speakers saying "kill the Jews and rape their daughters."
Yes, I mean the people who believe that are evil to the most extreme possible degree. If they actually believe that, it's not safe for them ever to be a member of any human society. Ever,
okay,
literally.
so how do we deal with those people?
Oh, and those people, if they think that, they're so mentally ill that they're not even safe to be a member of society, and they're inciting serious violence, they should probably be in prison for most of the rest of their lives. People who actually who say that and mean it and intend that to be true, right, are fundamentally dangerous people who can never be trusted ever again.
So, in a society in which James Petts is prime minister, king perhaps, what kind of process, what kind of legal process would you go through in identifying those people?
Well, I mean, the same as anything else, right? If they are inciting serious crimes and they seriously mean it, they could be arrested and tried for inciting those crimes, which was already a crime, and punished in accordance with the law.
All right, Governor, I was just having a laugh with my mates.
Well, that's what I mean by serious, right? You have a forensic process which determines whether or not those people are telling the truth when they say that.
Okay, what about people right now in the UK who are running around London waving ISIS flags or showing solidarity with Hamas, harassing Jewish children on the way to school? How would you deal with those people?
You've got a whole long list of different things, each of which are quite different. So first of all, someone deliberately harassing someone is committing a very serious wrong indeed, especially if done on sectarian grounds, and again should be in prison for a very, very, very long time for each individual incident.
Not deported if they were foreign nationals?
Sorry?
Not deported if they were foreign nationals, or stripped of their UK citizenship if they were dual nationals?
No, I think there's something fundamentally wrong with the idea that you treat criminals differently depending on which nationality they come from. I don't think that's any proper basis for that. All criminals should be treated on the basis of the severity of their crime, not which country they come from. But people who do that, who actually deliberately harass children because of what their background is, are deeply evil and again must be in prison for an extremely long time.
The problem being, of course, that prisons are a breeding ground for ideology as well.
Only if you allow prisoners to mix with other prisoners, and that's I mean, allowing that is a fundamental problem of prisons that needs to be solved.
So you'd have them in solitary confinement?
Not necessarily in solitary confinement. I mean, people might be able to meet occasionally with their family on meeting days and so forth, but it's really dangerous to allow criminals to mix with other criminals in prison because they form a society of criminals, right? The prison should be, every waking moment of prisoners' life should be geared towards reform, and those who don't engage with that process should be in prison much longer than those who do.
What would be the economic realities of creating such a system?
You need a different kind of government which doesn't have a very large amount of things competing for it for resources, which is one that focuses only on those things that are where governmental coercion is inherent. So you'd have to break off all, as is necessary to prevent abuse anyway, because governments have a corrupt incentive not properly to fund prison systems. You'd have to break off all the things that governments do that aren't actually inherent to government, which you need to do anyway to prevent abuse and corruption, which is endemic. I think we possibly talked about this in the
the
economic liberalism. So I refer people to that. I'm not sure what order they're coming out in.
No, neither am I.
But you'd have to have that kind of reform in order to allow for that to happen, and that's one of the reasons why it's really important.
Very good, quite. So, let's try and wrap this up because I don't want to keep you for too long, and it's 10 to 10 here in Tokyo. Finally, on the Institute for Liberal Values and making statements,
Yes.
do you want to close on that?
Well, again, I haven't heard what Elizabeth said in this podcast. I heard what she said earlier, and I would certainly agree with the idea that making some kind of general statement has very little value. I don't really understand what the function of it is. You only make a statement insofar as you actually have power to do something directly about the thing. Right? There's no point in making some generalized political statement about every possible thing that one could have. And if you start making statements, there's then a significance of not making a statement. Right? So if you start waving a flag every time that somebody becomes invaded, and again, this is the problem with people putting up, for example, Ukrainian flags when Ukraine was invaded. It's perfectly right to condemn the invasion of Ukraine, but if you put up a flag, right, do you keep it up forever? Do you take it down at some point? Does taking it down have some significance? Then do you put up a flag every time that someone ends up being invaded or having a war in that context? Do you have some kind of flag for every cause you support? For each statement you make or each thing that you support, you have to vet that very carefully and precisely, know very clearly what the position is, in order to be able to put out something useful. And you're not realistically going to be able to have every conceivable cause. But if you do that, then not doing so has some kind of meaning, whereas it doesn't if you don't ever do it. And it's just not a viable or sensible thing. There's no worthwhile function. The amount of work involved is very great. The function is virtually zero, because there's no meaningful point. And I think you said at the beginning that one of the issues is that it actually involves organizations purporting to speak on behalf of their members, which of course is fundamentally wrong.
Sure.
That's not what an organization does. If you're McDonald's or Coca-Cola or Ford or something, the fact that the directors, the people who have power in that organization, have this belief doesn't mean that they are entitled to speak on behalf of everyone else who just happens to work for them, putting parts into cars or fizzy drinks into bottles. And that's the kind of impermissible collectivism that we've been talking about all along.
Very good. I would add, just to I don't know, summarize my own position. I have no sectarian or tribal loyalties with Israel or the Jews. But I do have a loyalty to a country that is a beacon of, in my view, democracy and tolerance. Certainly when compared to the regimes that surround it. And therefore I have a loyalty towards other liberals, because I think liberals tend to make better societies. Anything to add on that point?
Well, only when and to the extent that they are actually liberal, and to that precise extent. And so one should never shy away from criticizing an organization because there are worse ones, even if the worst ones are much worse. So it's just like people saying, well, it's not too bad a crime because it's not as bad as other crimes, when it's actually bad enough to be a crime in the first place. So one should never hold back from the most intense, rigorous scrutiny of the behavior of an organization, merely because there are ones that are even worse, even if they're orders of magnitude worse.
I don't know. I think I'm more comfortable dealing with grey zones, perhaps, in a way. But that's okay. I'm not a lawyer, right?
Well, I mean, I'm not. I don't think. I mean, I was suggesting being comfortable dealing with grey zones in the sense that one has an organization that is much better than its surroundings, but nonetheless still has problems, and you should never hold back in criticizing it for those problems, even if it's good at other things. It's not a binary, right? There are lots and lots of details.
No.
Each of those details requires individual consideration.
No, but we shouldn't. One of the problems with the analysis that's going on large parts of the left right now with regards to Israel is that they are letting the good be victim to the perfect, right? That you hold Israel up to this impossibly high standard, which is okay in one sense, that you're, if it's self-criticism, you're genuinely trying to improve it. But when you have this very one-sided criticism, when Israel is held up to these impossibly high standards and the nations around them aren't, then I think there are issues there.
Yes, and the problem is people not holding other places up to high standards, not holding up Israel to high standards, right?
So what would be the motivation for that, do you think?
What's the motivation for individuals to be inconsistent?
No, I mean, in this, well, okay, I mean, we can talk to that point too, but I suspect there might be a multitude of answers to that depending upon the context, right?
But I don't think I've enough information to know that, but yes.
Yeah, exactly. But there is something puzzling about Israel. It's funny that Israel, in spite of the fact that it is, again, relative to the nations around it, and that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be criticized, of course, or that it hasn't done anything wrong. But relative to the nations around it, which are doing a lot more wrong, be that Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, all of those countries have far worse human rights abuses than Israel does. And yet Israel is, and by the way, are actively hostile to the West. Well, not so much Egypt and Jordan, but the other ones are more actively hostile to the West. But Israel is nevertheless singled out while these countries are kind of ignored. I mean, what's going on there?
It's the ignoring the other countries is the thing that's wrong, right? So the correct approach is to say that any departure from proper liberal principles is abuse and must be dealt with severely. That's consistent and that's rational. Not doing that is a problem. And not doing that, and that entails criticism of all kinds of governments. So not just Israel, but the UK and the US, France and Germany, and
Sure.
all the governments that are of the so-called Western countries are guilty of quite serious abuses in many cases, quite serious repression of people's fundamental freedoms just for the corrupt interest of the people who happen to be in power. And all of that should be criticized very stringently. And of course, you just have even more extreme criticism of the governments such as Syria and Jordan and Lebanon, who are even more extreme in that respect. And if one's not going to get far in persuading anybody by not holding people to a consistent standard, because that's obviously abuse and that's obviously dishonest.
So would you be able to hazard a guess as to why Israel is singled out here? Because it does seem to be, doesn't it? Or maybe you disagree.
Different people have different motives. I mean, one can guess, but I don't know how accurate the guess would be. I mean, one can look at some of the far left rhetoric and guess that one of the reasons that Israel might be singled out is because of its prosperity, and the people on the far left have some kind of irrational aversion to prosperity. But I don't know whether that really is the motivation, or whether that's just something that people use to try to cover things up.
That was Thomas Sowell's take, by the way. He there's a famous YouTube clip you can look up. You probably quite enjoy it, when he recounts a situation where a senior Jewish leader comes up to him and says, "Thomas, what can we do to improve the image of the Jews?" Well, stop being so successful. But he's quite right. I mean, if you look at the plight of people who are perceived to be middlemen groups and not adding any value to society, which is of course complete nonsense. They do add value to society, are often treated accordingly. And it's a terrible shame.
I think that's an interesting thing to say about that as well.
Yeah, and Enlightenment Now, maybe.
Oh, it's. I think it's a lecture that I watched on a video, but he may have written it in the book as well.
Okay, an issue. I don't know. I am just at the moment, as one Brit to another, I am utterly appalled by what I'm seeing in London, and a lot of Jewish people with whom I'm acquainted who live in London want to leave now, which is a tragedy.
I mean, it's not just anti-Semitism; it's also anti-Muslim stuff, of course, which is equally evil. And so it's the important thing is to treat all those who treat people in that kind of sectarian, abusive way extremely harshly. So any individual who behaves in that way to either Jewish people or Muslim people needs to have the most extreme personal consequences, lifetime consequences as a result of that. It's not safe for people who've ever behaved like that ever to be a member of any society.
Very good. And we shall end on that point of, I don't know, it's very Popper-esque of you, wasn't it? Kind of the paradox of tolerance. All right. Thanks very much, James.
Have a lovely evening.
You too.